I'm so delighted to welcome all of you here today. My name is Tara Nummedal. I'm the History Department here and the Director of the Program in Science and Technology Studies here at Brown. And I'm just so pleased to see all these people here and to have our wonderful guests here today. And to welcome you to this symposium. I already mentioned the hashtag, but hashtag AFS Symposium if you're tweeting. I wanted to start with some thank yous because as is fitting when you're arranging an event to honor someone like Anne Fausto-Sterling, it involves a lot of different people and a lot of different units on campus. So I just want to make sure I get all my thank yous out to start. First to our three sponsors of this event, the Pembroke Center, Kay Warren, Director here, the Department of Molecular Biology, Cell Biology, and Biochemistry, and Kim Mowry, who's the chair of that department, the Program in Science Technology Studies, and also the STAR Lectureship Fund, and particularly Dean of the Faculty, Kevin McLaughlin. All of these units have really generously supported this event and made it happen. I also want to mention a number of other people who have helped with everything from flowers to this exhibit and so on. From the Pembroke, Martha Hamblett, Christy Law Blanchard, Donna Goodnow, Denise Davis. From the STS program, Terry Gerzon, who's in the back there, Julissa Bautista, Mary Beth Bryson, to our student assistant, Claudia Norton, who helped with the poster and programs, and Alexa Ronan, who is here somewhere taking pictures. Also, a special thanks to Wendy Corwin, who put together this exhibit from the Anne Fausto-Sterling papers, which is part of the Pembroke Center's Feminist Theory Archive. And I want to make sure that everyone notices that along the back wall there is an exhibition of all kinds of interesting things from Anne's papers, and invite you to take a look at that at the coffee break after our first panel here. I also want to thank a few people in particular who kind of helped think of what this event would look like today. And Elizabeth Weed, Lundy Brown, and especially Assistant Director of the Pembroke Center, Debbie Weinstein, who was incredibly helpful in thinking through all the little details of this event. Most of all, though, my thanks go to Anne Fausto-Sterling. This event was initially inspired by the fact that, as we know, Anne is taking on a new title soon, the Nancy Duke Lewis Professor Emerita. And we wanted to find a way to acknowledge this moment, and especially to celebrate the 42 years that Anne has spent at Brown as a scholar, a teacher, an activist, an institution builder, and most recently, tweeter, Facebooker, blogger. For those of you who follow her, you'll know she's very active. And we're trying to think of what to do, and we thought, well, we could have a party. Parties are good, and we will. We'll have a reception at the end of today. We sort of tried to talk her into giving a talk about her own life and career at Brown. But ultimately, we all decided that the best way to honor Anne was to showcase the kind of work that Anne has spent her own life doing. And that is interdisciplinary work, feminist work on the intersection of science, gender, and the body. And so we decided to invite 4 scholars here today, and a 5th who will have a conversation with Anne in the second part of our program, who are doing exactly that kind of work. To, as Anne puts it, kind of showcase the next generation or two of scholars. And I think that says a lot about Anne, that that's what she wanted to do for today. So first I'll introduce our 4 speakers, and they'll each speak individually, and we'll take a couple of questions directly to their talks, and then hopefully we'll have time at the end for some more general kind of conversation. Then Anne may say a word, and we'll take a break for coffee to give you time to look at the exhibition, and then we'll return for a conversation on the past, present, and future of this kind of work with Evelyn Hammonds and Anne Fausto-Sterling before we adjourn to the party, which is the necessary part of this as well. So, our first speaker today is Ginger Hoffman, to my right, who's Assistant Professor of Philosophy at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. And she works at the intersection of the philosophy of psychiatry, normative and applied ethics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and feminist theory. And I'll just pause for a second to say, introducing all of these speakers involves a lot of things that you all work at the intersection of, which is the point, so take note. Makes them hard to introduce, though. Ginger holds 2 PhDs, one in neuroscience and one in philosophy, and she's also held postdocs at Harvard in history of science and in the Mind-Brain Behavior Initiative. She is an author of a number of articles, but I'll just mention one, What, If Anything, Can Neuroscience Tell Us About Gender Differences, which is in an edited volume called Neurofeminism, Issues at the Intersection of Feminist Theory and Cognitive Science, which was edited by Anne Jacobson to her right, co-edited. And today she will speak to us on Desexing the Mind, Perspectives on the Legacy of Anne Fausto-Sterling from the Philosophy of the Mind. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm set. Thank you. Okay. So I'll continue briefly with the thank yous. I want to thank Tara and all the organizers and Anne for inviting me. I'm so honored to be here. As Tara mentioned, I started my career as a scientist, and although Anne may not know it, she has been a huge inspiration to me in trying to help understand how to think about science in the context of greater political, philosophical, and moral issues. So, I want to start with a question that motivated my research. And this question has to do with neuroscientific studies looking at differences in the brain between sexes or between genders. I realize there's a long history of studying the distinction between sex and gender. Sometimes I'll actually use them interchangeably, which some might take huge issue with, but I think it sort of speaks to the complexity of trying to understand the difference of those. Okay, and I want to start actually where Fausto-Sterling starts in Sexing the Body at the beginning of chapter 5. So she says, look, even if there were such a thing as a gender-diverse utopia, some would argue that no matter how widely we opened the door, ineluctable differences between groups would remain. And the groups she's talking about are the traditionally conceived two sexes. She continues, scientists, such naysayers would argue, have proven that in addition to our genitalia, key anatomical differences between the male and female brain make gender an important marker of ability. They might cite well-publicized claims that, compared to men's, the corpus callosum in women's brains is larger or more bulbous, and that, they would exclaim, will limit forever the degree to which most women can become highly skilled mathematicians, engineers, and scientists. So I think a lot of us here, maybe all of us here, could automatically rattle off maybe 5 reasons why the naysayers' logic here doesn't quite work. Just because we see a difference in the brain doesn't mean that it's something that can't be changed, it's something that's natural or good, etc. But not everyone is so critical of this sort of line of reasoning, and some self-help authors, in particular, I'm referring to Barbara and Alan Pease, who I'd like to cite in my talks, because I find them particularly motivating in terms of doing work in this area. They say that basically differences in the brain are what cement and justify this idea that women just can't succeed in certain realms. And they're trying to be soothing about it. They say many women feel that there are failures, that women in general have failed by not conquering male-dominated areas. That's simply not true. Women haven't failed. They've merely not been particularly well equipped to enter areas that suit male brains much more. So don't worry, it's just that, you know, you shouldn't try because you can't do it. It's just not how you are. And they say that, look, the reason that women don't succeed in certain areas is because of basic biology and how our brains are organized. Okay, so this got me thinking in a pretty crass way, I have to say, about these studies that people have taken and drawn such conclusions from. These studies that look at differences in the brain is what Anne Fausto-Sterling calls sexing the brain, and I'll use that term too. Put bluntly, should these studies even be done? Okay, so I realize that there are a lot of good reasons to do studies like this, and I'm not going to argue anything as extreme as we should halt all neuroscientific research on sex differences now. But I do think that there's a reason to question how forcefully we should proceed in these studies and when they should be done and how. Okay. So the reason I think that we should proceed with caution in doing these studies is not, I'm not going to focus on the possible harms that have come about through the self-help books like the Pieces, and there's many, many others, and all sorts of people use neuroscientific studies to fuel whatever brain whatever gender stereotype you can think of. I actually think that there might be a different reason that we should be cautious about doing such studies, and that is that the studies looking for brain differences between genders might not actually be as scientifically useful as we think. And that is because I think that in some cases, seeing a brain difference between genders doesn't necessarily signal any noticeable difference between them. So in other words, it doesn't necessarily imply that there will be a mental or a behavioral difference between them. And I'm going to tell you why. There are actually a lot of reasons why this might be the case, and Fausto-Sterling herself lays some out in Sexing the Body, but I want to offer a new reason that this might be the case. And if this is the case, then all the fruitful scientific results we think we're getting might be more limited than we think. Okay, so in order to do this, I need to back up and think a little bit about the relationship between the mind and the brain, and in order to do that, I want to talk about the relationship between nature and nurture. Okay, so I'm defining both of these terms broadly. Fausto-Sterling sets a helpful path for us in trying to complicate the relationship between these two things. So nature, which I might also call the body or the individual or biology, is going to, can you see my cursor here or no? Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. So nature, I think, will refer to things that are within the boundaries of the body. Nurture is going to refer to anything outside. So I've schematized it perhaps a little too simplistically with this green circle. Really, it's referring to anything outside of the boundaries of the body. It might be called culture or world or the environment. Right now, I'm just conflating all these terms together. Okay. So, to understand my original claim that seeing a brain difference doesn't necessarily imply a behavioral difference, we're backing up, and I want to try to understand possible relationships between nature and nurture. One relationship is that they're distinct and separate. This is called nature and nurture dualism. The idea is that nature and nurture are independent and have limited, if any, influence on one another. Okay. And right now, for simplicity, I hope, I'm going to speak of the mind and the brain as identical. I realize that that could mean a lot of different things, but basically, you know, we're assuming the mind is here, and I will talk more about this soon. Okay, so is nature and nurture dualism a viable way to think about the relationship between nature and nurture? Fausto-Sterling wisely denies this stance. She says partitioning genes from environment, nature from nurture is a scientific dead end. Furthermore, nature and nurture is indivisible. That makes sense. I think it's not the most radical claim, but depending on how we envision this indivisibility, it could mean a number of different things. So, when Fausto-Sterling, and I'm referring mainly to Sexing the Body, when she's exploring how nature and nurture are related and how they're indivisible, she quotes Judith Butler, who says, "We discover that matter is fully sedimented with discourses on sex and sexuality." And I'm really interested in what this means and what the nature of this sedimentation might be. So matter, presumably, would be what I'm calling nature, and discourses on sex and sexuality would be part of culture or nurture. So basically, in my sort of schematic, the idea here is that elements within nurture influence and change fundamentally the matter in here, or the nature. How might this work? There are all sorts of examples. You could think that learning about gender norms might create new synapses or change dendritic branching or something like that. But the idea is that nurture sediments into the mind. Now, I think that that's one plausible and true way that the relationship between nature and nurture obtains, but I think that there's another way to complexify the relationship between these two things, and that is by using what is known as the extended mind. The extended mind, as I introduce it, was basically first made popular in its current guise by a 1998 paper by Andy Clark and David Chalmer entitled The Extended Mind. In it, they say that what happens is that an individual's mind can and does extend outside of the boundaries of her body in the most literal way. They say the mind spreads into the world. Here is a quotation from that paper, sort of the canonical quotation: the mind extends into the world. Okay, so continuing with my diagrams, the idea is that the extended mind is supposedly a case where the mind just expands beyond the boundaries of the individual or the boundaries of nature. Now, in my schematics, what I'm doing is I'm trying pretty simply to represent what the mind is by whatever is inside of a black border. Okay. So just as Butler and Fausto-Sterling, drawing from her, think that the mind might be sedimented with nurture, it could be that nurture or the environment is sedimented with the mind. This might be a little confusing or mysterious, so I'm going to give you an example of from the Clark and Chalmers original paper, trying to lay this out. This is an example of two fictional characters named Inga and Otto. And here's the situation. Okay. So Otto is an individual who has Alzheimer's disease, and he carries around a notebook with him that has important pieces of information. He hears about an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, and sounds like it's intriguing, decides he wants to go, and realizes he needs to recall where MoMA is located. So he consults his notebook and learns or recalls that MoMA is on 53rd Street. Inga is someone without Alzheimer's disease. She hears about the same exhibit. She's intrigued. She wants to go. She realizes that she needs to remember where MoMA is located, and so she consults her memory, or her internal memory, and realizes that it is on 53rd Street. So the idea here is that both Inga and Otto have a belief that MoMA is located on 53rd Street. Inga's belief is constituted by, or identical to, again, I'm assuming mind-brain identity, a particular brain state. Otto's belief that MoMA is on 53rd Street is constituted by some writing in his notebook. So that's an example of how Clark and Chalmers envision the mind literally extending. They say there's no good reason to deny that the writing in Otto's notebook is not a belief, and assume that Inga's brain state is a belief. They use what they call the parity principle to claim this. Okay, so I think if the mind does extend in this way, I think this is how it casts doubt on the scientific utility of sexing the brain. Okay, so if the mind is extended, then simply, if we're looking at the brain to understand what's going on in the mind, we're not getting the whole story. So more specifically, let's say we want to understand why different genders behave differently or have different mental states. If we do this by looking at the brain and we see a brain difference between genders, this may not translate to an actual mental or behavioral difference between them, because there might be parts of the mind outside of the skull that play compensatory roles. So I've tried to illustrate this as possible. Let's call the pink circles some sort of mental activity. It could be all sorts of things. This refers to an individual's mind. It's within this black border. And basically we see, let's say this is supposed to represent females and this is supposed to represent males. It looks like they actually both have this activity. But if we're just looking at the brain, we might falsely conclude that only women have this activity. However, if we look at the entire mind, we would conclude that actually they both have this activity. So here's an example. This is an example that has been conclusively shown to be an example of how mental states extend, but this is just a possible way that this might happen. So women are purported to have better memory of salient emotional events than men do. However, these studies are done by judging memory when the body is isolated from external elements like diaries, notebooks, photographs. And so the studies might literally be judging memory in the absence of parts of one's mind. And trying to understand this difference between genders by only focusing on the brain isn't looking at the whole picture. So again, if you think, okay, this sort of mental activity is an emotional memory, I made it look sort of like a notebook. If you're just looking at the brain, oh yes, women have heightened emotional memory. But if you look at the entire mind, you might see that men have similarly acute emotional memory. It's just realized in a different part of their mind, which might be a notebook. Now, does this happen? Not necessarily. Again, this is just a hypothetical example of how the extended mind might shed light on why neuroscientific studies are only giving us part of the picture. Okay, now, one caveat to my caveat. So I'm saying, look, we have to be cautious with these neuroscientific studies because they might not tell us the whole story. However, presumably not all mental states extend. Presumably they're only going to be certain, maybe even rare instances where this would be the case. For mental states that are contained totally within the brain, then yeah, why not just look at the brain? Now, some people actually give me a way to answer this by saying a lot more mental states are extended than we think. And there's been basically an explosion of work on the extended mind and related concepts. And one author in particular, whose name is Michelle Merritt, argues that gender itself is an extended mental state. And this is fascinating and intriguing, but something that I'm trying to unpack more precisely. So one quotation she has is that gender can be seen as sort of a tool that, when we are coupled to it in the right sort of way, constitutes cognition. So it is part of cognition. She gives the example, drawing from Iris Young, women thinking about crossing a creek when they're with a lot of male hiking companions, may or may not, I mean, she's not trying to stereotype about all women, have a fear of getting hurt, of getting dirty, of being embarrassed because of a tumble. So this fear might be a case where a mental state is extended through gender into the world. This is what Merritt is proposing. I'm trying to understand this in a little more detail. Merritt says, but thinking through gender is a process that locates cognition beyond the confines of the skull, because my understanding that I am a woman is achieved only through participation with the larger social world. So again, thinking through gender explains how an understanding like I'm a woman, or even a fear of getting hurt, is achieved through participation with the larger social world. I tend to buy this quotation. I think this is right, but I'm not totally convinced that it's an example of bona fide extension that we've been talking about. Instead, it seems more like the picture of sedimentation that I originally started with. It seems more like whatever gender is, and it means so many different things, and Fausto-Sterling cites Lorber's classification of it, it might sediment into the mind and change it that way. And Merritt herself, even though she wants to claim literally that gender is an extension of thinking, an extension of the mind, in another part of the paper she says, as I will argue, the sort of manipulated thinking Gallagher cites is better thought of as a sort of invasion of the mind by external social practices, norms, and systems, rather than a mind leaking out into the world. Okay, so she does seem to actually acknowledge that this is more a case of sedimentation rather than extension. So at this point, I don't know how many of you are philosophers and how many of you have thoughts about philosophy, but I've been talking about a few different metaphysical, or if you will, ontological distinctions between sedimentation, extension. Does the world constitute the mind, or does it just cause the mind? Why does this matter? Does it actually have practical implications? I imagine if I were listening to the talk, all these things about sedimented, extended might be swimming around. And when one works in the field of the extended mind, this is one of the most common criticisms. People say, look, everyone acknowledges that the environment affects the mind. Who cares how it affects it? It affects it. Why do you care that the mind literally extends into the world? I think the reason it matters is for my initial question about what neuroscientific studies can tell us about the mind. So it matters for the specific question of whether seeing a brain difference between two groups or two or more groups implies a mental difference. So here are the possible scenarios. One is that, the environment causes something in the mind. One is that the environment sediments or invades the mind. And one is that the mind extends beyond the confines of the body. So if we want to understand what is going on in the mind, and presumably we often do for a variety of reasons, in the first two scenarios, if the world causes the brain-mind, mental differences should be seen by looking at the brain. Same with if it sediments. The world should leave traces in the brain, however that is, or whatever sort of traces they might be. But we should, theoretically, be able to get the whole story about what's going on in the mind by looking in the brain. But if the mind is extended, then by just focusing on this part, we're presumably not going to get the whole story. And that is why I think, these distinctions that might all sort of seem to conflate together actually do have practical implications. And I think that this is exciting for philosophers because philosophers working on extended mind, as I said, often get the criticism like, well, does it really matter? I think this is an example of how it might matter. Okay, so my conclusions about the extended mind are, although I'm intrigued by Merritt's idea that gender is a mental extension, I am not yet convinced that it fully succeeds, or rather I don't know exactly how it does succeed if it does. She basically says all of our thoughts are gendered, which I'm willing to entertain, maybe. I don't know. I need to think a lot about that. But I'm not exactly sure what she means by all of our thoughts being extended out of the body through gender. So I'm intrigued by it. I think further work could be done, but I don't think it gives me this very broad conclusion that I could get if her claim succeeded. But I do think that to the extent that there are some cases where the mind might genuinely extend beyond the body, so maybe cases of memory, emotional memory, similar to the Otto-Inga example, or maybe cases of thinking navigationally, maybe a map constitutes cognition in some way. That's also a gender difference that often gets cited. To the extent that there are some genuinely extended mental states, neuroscientific studies that target them may not be revealing the full story about what's going on in the minds of men and women and other people who don't fall into those categories. So even if the brain is sexed, or we do see sex differences in the brain, the mind might not be. So my overall conclusions are, not only may doing these scientific studies, sexing the brain, not only may it lead to harmful gender stereotypes, but it might not even give us the full story about mental differences that it promises. So I think that there's reason to proceed with caution before conducting such studies. Just to know that this is a possible limitation, and to design studies with that in mind, and to continue the conversation about what these studies are doing and when they're useful and when they might be harmful. And I also think this concept of the extended mind offers a new way to complicate the relationship between nature and nurture and biology and culture, something that Fausto-Sterling has done beautifully, and perhaps this is another tool to do that. So, thank you very much.
So I think we have time for one or two questions, and then we'll have more time at the end. Evelyn.
Yeah. The conclusions?
Yes. So would it be correct to say that not only may sexing the brain lead to harmful gender stereotypes, but
okay.
Gendering the brain could lead to harmful stereotypes as well?
Absolutely. So even if we extend our domain to look at the extensions, of course, absolutely.
Because the genders are all about the social, so that's already outside. So one might see the reverse. If you're looking from the outside in, you're bringing those same stereotypes into what you think sex is.
Right. I mean, it could even more readily lead to harmful gender stereotypes if we open up our studies to, okay, we're trying to find mental differences between genders. Let's look at props or, elements in the world outside. Absolutely. I think just knowing that, though, we would also want to be very cautious about what sort of elements in the world we're looking at, because we're going to be relying on gender stereotypes to do that. Oh, well, women have purses, so that's going to be where their minds extend, and men have technological devices. So we're going to, okay, in our study now, we've bought the extended mind. These philosophers have convinced us. So we're going to put people in a brain imager, and then for men, we're going to look at their cell phones. And for women, we're going to look at their lipstick, or, okay, that's a bit, that's not really fair. But yeah, we're going to look, I think it definitely opens the door for ill-designed studies. Even if the studies aren't ill-designed, I do think there's a worry that, all sorts of people can still use these to reinforce stereotypes. And I think that gets to a bigger question that many, many people have devoted a lot of work to about, okay, how important is knowledge if it's producing harmful, political information? And I haven't touched on that. And you're right. I think it could even be more dangerous. Should I field questions?
Let's take one more, maybe Elizabeth, and catch you over there.
Thank you for an interesting talk. Is there any work in this field that does not rely on the notion of inside-outside?
Specifically in drawing from the Clark-Chalmers. I mean, there's the idea of enactivism, which tries to just erase boundaries pretty much wherever they occur. And actually, enactivists care a lot about mind seeping into the world and world seeping into the mind, but they say, why are we even drawing that distinction? And that's just causing more problems. Yeah.
I want to take one more in the back, since that was...
Yeah.
What, last one.
About this whole issue of just the difficulty of women getting into corporate world or whatever world, and that the fact that men have structured everything out there for their brains, and if we want to, do we need to change the whole structure of everything so that so it works the way women's brain does? I mean, is that what ultimately what's necessary to get to the point of having the minds have equal opportunity? In other words, the corporate world is structured with some of the things in the brain of a male, even though, as you say, if that was structured differently, the resulting success and ability of the mind of a woman would be kind of, I think, probably a little better than the way it's working with the men. But it requires also changing all the structure, how everything is set up for...
I think that may well be the case. I don't have a map for exactly how to...
I know. It was just a realization.
Well, I do think that one of the things that I am proposing, and I don't know to what extent this holds, is that thinking that, say, the corporate world is structured because a male brain is a certain way, I'm not convinced that a male mind is necessarily as different from a woman's mind as we might think. Now...
Oh, you mean even like using this structure that men created, the women can create a mind that's the same, but there might be ways that their mind would work even better in a different structure, let's say.
Of course, of course. I just think that a lot of people justify the idea that women aren't succeeding in certain spheres because their brains aren't structured in the right way. But I think that might be the case, and it might be because their brains aren't structured in the right way because culture has made them that way, of course. But it might even be that mentally they're actually more similar than we think, because we're not looking at the full mind.
Issues, yeah.
So I'm definitely open to that possibility, but I think that this idea of difference often gets really picked up and reified and celebrated, and it's thought to be inevitable and permanent and things like that. And I just want to show one small way, I think, that maybe the differences aren't even there, depending on how we conceptualize the mind. Now, they might be. I mean, there's more work to be done, but I'm just sort of opening the door on a possibility, or I'm trying to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Try not. I'm going to stick this right here.
So our next speaker is Anne Jacobson, who is professor of philosophy and electrical and computer engineering and director of the Center for Neuroengineering and Cognitive Science at the University of Houston. Her work deals with the intersection of history of philosophy, philosophy of mind, neurophilosophy, and feminist philosophy. She is the author of Keeping the World in Mind, Mental Representations and the Sciences of the Mind, and a co-editor of Neurofeminism, which I've already mentioned, Issues at the Intersection of Feminist Theory and Cognitive Science, as well as the editor of a collection of feminist interpretations of Hume. And she blogs at feministphilosophers.wordpress.com. And she'll be speaking to us today on social norms in a science of the mind. Make sure you speak.
Thank you. There's a recent comment about, let me ask, how many people here are in philosophy departments or do philosophy? A few. Okay, so you'll know that there have been some scandals recently. And so there's a lot of discussion about this. And someone in another blog said, well, we owe a lot to our courageous colleagues on feminist philosophers for bringing some of this out. And I wrote in response, I love the idea of being courageous, but I'm really just very pissed off. And one thing I've learned is that trying to be honest and move forward at least gives you a self that you can largely count on. Okay, I am so delighted to be here. I think that from my perspective, Anne Fausto-Sterling has, among the many, many things she's done, has really focused on a concept, a kind of distinction, and to some extent Ginger and I agree about, and we're going to be talking about somewhat the same thing, though my perspective is a bit different. And I'm immensely grateful to it. Now, on the plane, I was reading some other for work, and I thought, oh God, I feel so outclassed. Maybe I just won't do this. Okay, so let me start with the outline. I'm going to talk about Anne Fausto-Sterling's, one of the problems she sees with the sex-gender distinction. And I'm going to be looking at material to some extent that's from Sex in the Body. And what I want to ask is whether the problem, which I haven't really described yet, that she sees transfers over to cognitive neuroscience. And my answer is going to be yes. And I'm going to mention briefly two kinds of cognitive neuroscience, both of which are amazingly asocial. And then I wanted to ask, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with the cognitive science that draws an inner-outer distinction? I mean, how could cognitive science not draw an inner-outer distinction? Well, I think that's very problematic. So I'm going to question it, and I'm going to question it starting with an anecdote from Chimera, whom some of people here, anybody who's he's a London neuroscientist, really done stunning work on distinguishing on the perception of motion, but he's also done wonderful work on art. And he was visiting us at Houston, visiting my group in Houston. And what I'm going to say is that what we see is there's a notion of flourishing that runs through a lot of general concepts that people use to talk about cognitive neuroscience. And that when we get this issue, first of all, it's a notion that relates some of the very basic terms like vision, thinking, to a social world. But secondly, it's a very problematic notion. I don't think it's really been drawn out. It hasn't been analyzed, and it's capable of causing enormous amount of harm of a sort that Anne Fausto-Sterling recently talked about in a different kind of case in the Boston Record. So that's the plan. It's Anne Fausto-Sterling has noted this divide between sex and gender can be taken to give us this division. First of all, we have on the one side the body, which is supposed to be the domain of nature and science, and on the other side, culture and nurture and stuff like that. And the charge that one can make against this is that it gets us into a lot of trouble by, among other things, saying that the body can be successfully and completely studied independently of culture. What we do is artificially segment the mind, the body from the culture, rather than seeing us, to use again one of Anne's phrases, rather than seeing us as biocultural. So we want to see ourselves as biocultural entities. And as things are now, although it's getting better, and partly because of Anne's work, as things are now, one often finds oneself in a position where you've got the cultural theorists and the feminists on the one side who are increasingly getting to hate the science, and the scientists who are increasingly thinking that these people are just not worth listening to. And I wish I could remember who it was. I think it may have been something reported by Victoria Pitts-Taylor in an article in Hypatia this spring, I think, or it might have been last spring. She quotes sociologists saying, oh, you know, those cognitive neuroscientists, they're just impossible. They're getting into our territory. I mean, we do culture, right? They don't. So, okay, let me see. So what would it be like to think of the mind as the brain, where we think of the brain as really independent of anything outside it? So you can, you know, like you study a corpse, well, if you study the brain, you want one that moves around, but still, you want to look at the inside. And interestingly, there's a nice quote from a philosopher, and to some extent, I should say, I'm looking at philosophers' take on cognitive neuroscience. It provides a nice target. Right, I better hold this up closer. One sort of understanding that cognitive scientists are often interested in achieving is analogous to the understanding that one would have of a clock if one could identify each of its functional parts, and the way in which all these parts interact to bring it about that the clock has a reliable disposition. So he says, thus, at least one of the goals of cognitive science will be to explain the micro-level processes that are characteristic of the mind. These are processes in which one mental event or state is caused by another mental event or state that precedes it as closely as possible. So here's the idea: studying the mind is studying these causal chains inside the body. And you might not want to think they're causal chains. You might have a network or something like that, which is not exactly causal chains, but it's studying the activity that's inside the brain. Now, there is something sort of staggeringly odd about this example. No amount of looking at the internal mechanisms of a clock will tell you that the clock does tell correct time. I mean, this is a project that cannot be carried out. If you buy a clock in San Francisco and bring it here, then it has to be recalibrated, right? And there's some important things. Clocks have to be calibrated, and possibly minds have to be calibrated with the world, but clocks certainly clearly have to be calibrated with the world. And secondly, there's a lot of slack in what we might seek about the kind of calibration in a clock. One thing, we might want a clock that always tells the correct time. Keep it in one place, but we want it in that one place to always tell the correct time. As far as I can see, there aren't many clocks made that way. At least every clock in my house has a different take on what time it is. And every once in a while we go around and try to get them. But it's obviously been much cheaper to build clocks that aren't consistently well calibrated. And part of the reason is because, you know, we don't have the sort of batteries that's going to keep the clock from slowing down. we don't have, especially, well, actually, the Northeast has had a terrible time, but we're coming up to hurricane season. And so, we don't have many clocks. The clocks that run on batteries are going to have problems, but the clocks that don't run on batteries are going to have other kinds of problems as trees fall on wires and things like that. So there's a lot of recalibration. And some of the considerations are really considerations that you might say get brought to bear in evolution. We may be, philosophers like to think that we are really well calibrated and that we really, really could get things absolutely and precisely right. But many people working on cognitive neuroscience and evolution have argued that, in fact, what evolution has decided is that a lot of our sensory mechanisms are good for getting us the gist of things that serve, for example, to find food, to fend ourselves, get mates, and things like that, but that they aren't giving us the kind of full worldview that only philosophers but ordinary people think that we have. So let me mention, this will be familiar to you, that actually there are two versions of cognitive neuroscience. There are the Cartesians, which is what Wedgwood is, and the Cartesians think it's all in the head. But there's another, the embodied and activist theorists. And here the essential part of cognition includes other body parts and activities, and even some parts of the environment. But with the exception of a very few people, for example, Michelle Merritt is one of them, and Sue Campbell, who tragically died, is another one of them. These theories are remarkably asocial. Right, so for example, there's actually now a fairly extended literature on whether your iPhone could have your memories in it. But there isn't much of a literature on whether other people have your memories or whether other people provide part of your memories, which is a thesis that Sue Campbell had. And you've heard about Michelle Merritt's. Right, so there's a nexus of problems here, and this actually is where my research is, and I wanted to mention that because I realize this is an interdisciplinary audience, and I've worried that people are saying, God, she's talking about cognitive neuroscience and vision and things, never heard about any of this stuff, and I am a world-class expert in the field. What's going on here? Well, I'm looking at a conjunction of problems, and they impact the cognitive neuroscience literature a lot, and they are philosophy's articulation of them, and they impact feminist theories a lot also. And I think that the notion of mental representation, which is what my book, Keeping the World in Mind, is really about, has been a very important and problematic part of this, because if you think there are mental representations, and obviously people like Wedgwood and Chris Post, famously Jerry Fodor, think that there are these mental representations and they're in your head, then you really do have a very strong inside-outside problem. If you think that instead some of the mind is extended, then you might be like Clark, who still believes in mental representations, but they're mental representations all around. And what I've been arguing is that these mental representations have, among other things, a huge problem. Nobody has explained how they've been able to cause things. That's a huge problem, and a couple of people have noticed this. But another huge problem is the mental representations that philosophers discuss are not the mental representations that show up in cognitive neuroscience, and I really argue that with tons of examples in Keeping the World in Mind. So that sort of locates what I'm saying, and I'm having trouble with this small screen. I think actually my glasses are, no, that's not going to make it better. So there's a huge gap. What's wrong? So let's look at what's wrong with the picture of a theory of mind that doesn't have the social in it. Okay. I think I'm not going to go on that page looking at the time. I'm going to get started with this. Chimera and I were talking one day, and I mentioned that we had a candidate for a job who was talking about confirmation hypotheses, and the candidate was maintaining that the more instances of a hypothesis you got, the better confirmed it was. And that seemed to be really strange. One community I know I'm quite closely connected to is the Superconductivity community at the Texas Center for Superconductivity at the University of Houston, where Paul Chu, discoverer of high-temperature superconductivity, is. Oh, thank you. That's fabulous. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So Zeki was, so I said I didn't think you know, people who are looking for superconducting material don't say, oh God, we made this material and it's superconducted today, and then we'll make some more tomorrow, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and maybe, oh, you know, if you get all sorts of people, you get 50 examples, and then it'll get more confirmed if we get 100 examples. And they don't work that way, because if you know the chemical essence, in effect, you don't need to get lots of other things with that same essence to see if it does the same thing. The challenge is rather whether you really did get a thing with that essence, and so whether the experiment, your original experiment, is repeatable. So Chimera, agreeing with me, said, and I'm not sure what his number was, but it might have been 11. Give me 11 kidneys and I can tell you what a kidney is. And I think that's just wrong, right? Because you could have excised, decaying, malfunctioning kidneys, and they might not enable him to tell that the kidneys remove waste from the blood. Right. What something is will often be characterized in terms of what it does when it's functioning well. And, oops, that's the next slide. And if you want to check that out, you could do as I did with Google. So you think, oh God, that's like a philosopher looking at that first sentence. You know, do you really know that's true? So I started to enter terms into Google and see how they were defined. And yeah, that's how we often approach things. We talk about what a heart is in terms of what it does when it's functioning well. I mean, clearly there are hearts around that aren't pumping, or that are pumping very badly. And when we talk about thumbs, one thing that's really important about a thumb is that it opposes these and that it moves in a very different way. So I am going to the next slide. So what we've got is the idea that I think extends over a lot of the terms in cognitive neuroscience. What we want to understand about vision is what vision is when it functions well. Philosophers are very interested in what is vision. So for example, we would like to know, and sometimes argue about, if you see somebody's shadow, are you seeing the person? This is not an issue in cognitive neuroscience, right? Because what cognitive neuroscience is interested in investigating are what are the mechanisms for seeing well, and what is going wrong with those mechanisms when people don't see well. So what is this seeing well? Or again, remembering well, having a good memory or a bad memory? Reed Montague has this interesting quote from 1999. It's interesting that, well, actually I'm not going to make a nasty comment about philosophy. It's interesting. Reed says, if you look at the heavy stuff, structures are constructed by evolution. So most creatures are tightly woven into particular environmental and social niches and are the answers to manifold questions posed by their environs. This is a very radical, different picture from the one that Wedgwood was posing. It's not about what computations you're performing in your head or what chains, causal chains are going on inside your head. It's rather how you're interacting with the environment, whether you're interacting well in order to support goals like nutrition, reproduction, survival. So if we want to know what functioning well is, should we understand it in terms of something like evolution? Maybe what functioning well is for something to have features that were selected by evolution. And I think that's not going to work. right? Because we've had this notion of functioning well since Aristotle, and there have been different emphases. I mean, Aristotle just thought things had a kind of telos, and which gets repeated into the Middle Ages. But a lot of people haven't taken that kind of picture. And with medicine, for example, medicine doesn't have to believe that, but medicine for 200 or 300 years has certainly had a notion of functioning well. And so trying to treat things that aren't functioning well. So I think what we have here is a very unanalyzed quasi-medical notion of working well, and that it's endemic in the sciences of the mind. And it's a notion that links what I think is I don't think there are these mental representations in the brain. That's a very Wittgensteinian view, right? I think that mental representations arise from kinds of social interactions when you're functioning well. Now, I'm just going to close with a comment about functioning well, because we need, I think, to think about it really very carefully. For the, give you the flipped picture. Actually, no, I'm not going to do that. As soon as we leave, I'll mention it because you've seen it. This is a picture. We don't know that one picture is a flip of the other picture. If the shadows at the bottom, we see it as bending out. If the shadows at the top, we see it as coming in. And we don't know whether that is because in human life, light almost always comes from above, or whether it's something that's carried in the genes in some way. We just don't know. But it is a universal feature. Okay. So, last real slide. As soon as we leave simple, this is why functioning well really needs to be looked at. As soon as we leave relatively simple mental sensory mechanisms, we are in dire danger of accepting a tyranny of the normal. And Anne Fausto-Sterling, in the Boston Review for April 7th, 2014, talks about this, letting go of normal. Turns out that some kids, that sleeping on the back may give you delayed motion as an infant, right? So you have abnormal, I mean, they don't die, but they're slower than the others. So skilled behavior required by a culture can be used as a basis for a deep evaluation of the person. They're not functioning well. That's really bad. And the latest that I know about came into existence in January 2014, because this is the first big article about it in a serious scientific journal. And this is the sluggish cognitive tempo, right? And this is so they're investigating the possibility of medicating children who are daydreaming, and they spend their time daydreaming and they're not thinking quickly, they're not really very engaged. Now, I mean, seems to me so dangerous. So if you look at the history if you look at writings on what gifted children are like, right, some of them have wonderful background support and they're focused and they just excel all the way through, but other equally gifted children have very adverse experiences and they opt out. And they spend their time daydreaming, among other things. I remember when I was in the 4th grade, my father's a military officer, and we went from coast to coast. And in the 4th grade, I decided that nothing adults said could be believed anymore, right? And so I was labeled retarded, of course. Right. So what do we do about this? One of the things I loved about Anne's work is that, you know, a lot of us, if we get involved in this nature-nurture arguments, at least the philosophical versions of it, people say, oh, well, what we do is we discover the flaws in the nature arguments, we discover the flaws in the nurture arguments. But Anne has said, look, we've got to look beyond this and think about things from a very different perspective, and that's her dynamical systems and her notion of looping. And I think that's just an extremely valuable thing to do, and we need to do that to get a grip, I think, on what in the world we're doing with this covertly evaluative notion that's present in the sciences of the minds and that's being used on, among other things, children. So that's it. The end.
Can you take a couple of questions?
Oh,
before
sure,
you-
yes.
Okay, we do have some time. Questions?
You said that mental states, as envisioned by Fausto or somebody like that, don't have any explanatory power. They don't explain how one event causes another event. How does your description of a more general mental representation, one that includes social norms, one that is extended in the language of the prior speaker, have any, explain anything causally? And are you guys really talking about the same thing, or just talking differently about the same thing, talking about the same thing differently?
Good. Great question. Let me just step back for a minute on this. What we've come to realize is something of a historical fact, and you'll see this discussed by Maschery in his recent book on concepts. So when philosophers got busy with mental representations, thanks to Jerry Fodor, which happened in the mid-70s, you look at the philosophical literature, there's a little discussion of mental representations, and then in 1975 it explodes, and this is really a lot of Fodor's interest. And Fodor said, look, a theory of mental representation should be a theory of the content of your thought. And so some people came along and he said, oh, well, you haven't thought with this content because you have these dispositions. And he really brought some telling objections to it. And so what most philosophical discussions of concepts has been concepts that tell you what the content of your thought is. And we have a big proliferation of these accounts of what the content of your thoughts is. But as Maschery points out, psychologists and neuroscientists and all these people are not so much interested in whether you're thinking about cats or rats. They're interested in how you're operating with whatever you have. And on that, the philosophical theories are largely just silent. Just silent. Now, what I wanted to say is that concepts come from a public language and social interaction and stuff like that. And that when neuroscientists talk about concepts talk about mental representations as in the brain, what they're using, interestingly enough, I think, is a different and very much older notion that comes in with Aristotle. And they think of the neural patterns as in some way reflecting, mirroring the patterns in the world. And so the idea is that we get this nice correlation. But there's no problem with how do neural patterns cause motion? I mean, God, that's what they do, I mean, you get this and it goes on to this part of the brain. And so mental representations in neuroscience are entirely unproblematic. Mental representations as understood by philosophy, we don't know. I mean, nobody's really come up with a good account. And every once in a while, people come up and say, it's like seeing somebody say, the emperor has no clothes. And I mean, when I had horrible times with publishers over keeping the world in mind. And the only way I got it published was these nice people who were dying to get neurofeminism because they thought, this is really going to sell. And I said, okay, you can have neurofeminism, but then you've got to publish this other book of mine.
Any other questions? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, great, thank you. Our next speaker is Rebecca Jordan-Young, who is the Fausto, Associate Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Barnard and Director of the Science and Social Difference Working Group at the Columbia University Center for the Study of Social Differences. Another one of these long titles. Her work deals with the intersection of science and social differences, especially gender, sexuality, and race. She's the author of Brainstorm, The Flaws in the Science of Sex Difference from 2010. She's also the co-founder of the International Neurogenderings Network, which is an international group of scholars interested in critical perspectives on sex, gender, and the brain. And she's currently collaborating with Katrina Karzakis and Helen Longino on a project on so-called sex testing of elite women athletes with high testosterone levels. She also has a whole other body of work on social epidemiology studies of HIV/AIDS. Today, she'll be speaking on Sex as Chimera, Tools for Unthinking Difference.
So do you, you need to really, I just want to show you that one slide at a time here, right? So hold on. That's all right. There we go. Okay, you have, all right. Thank you so much, Tara, and all of the organizers. I am thrilled and very, very honored to be here. From her writings and her presentations that I've had an opportunity to see for many years, now and then, and increasingly through wonderful, always informative and helpful email exchanges. Anne Fausto-Sterling has been one of the best teachers I've ever had, and is certainly one of the most important thinkers that I've encountered. And so it's just an honor beyond what I can tell you for me to be a part of this today. Thank you. I want to also give a couple of other acknowledgments. The ideas that I'm going to produce are all, that I'm going to tell you about are all collaboratively produced through work and conversations with Annalise Kaiser, Cordelia Fine, Gina Rapon, Katrina Karkazis, Jean Mager-Stelman, Kristen Springer, and Kili Czeslak-Postova. Those are the main people that I've collaborated with. Almost all of my work has been collaborative, which is really exciting and brings particular kinds of challenges, but I think is always worth it. And all of us draw upon an even broader network of feminist scientists and scholars of STS. Most especially today, I pulled forward ideas that draw very heavily on Anne's work. So I gave you the title of Sex as Chimera, and I wanted to just quickly give you 3 different definitions for chimera in which actually, by the end of the talk, I hope to have convinced you that sex fulfills all of these kinds of definitions. The first one, a fire-breathing she-monster in Greek mythology. I love that one. The B part of that, an imaginary monster compounded of incongruous parts. That's a very important definition to keep in mind. Second, an illusion or fabrication of the mind, especially an unrealizable dream. And third, an individual organ or part consisting of tissues of diverse genetic constitution. I'm not going to have time to explore this third one very much, but it's actually a very fun one that really does apply. So I'll keep going from there. So or moving forward from both Ginger and Anne's presentations, a theme that you hear is this definition of sex and this interesting, difficult boundary of gender and sex. And I'm mostly going to be talking in relation to brains and behavior. This applies to thinking about bodies more generally, and maybe we can talk about that later. Of course, none of us dispute the reality or materiality of bodies. Specific intra- and intercellular mechanisms, properties, potentials, the capacities and limits of specific tissues, organs, systems, and so on are not what we're questioning. The question that Anne has pushed at various points, and which I take up today, is how the concept of sex connects with the material body. And this demands additional questions like the following. What kind of variable is sex? How is sex entangled with gender? In the realm of neurosciences and psychology, we must ask, how does sex gender get into a brain, if indeed it is found there, picking up Ginger's question? How do investigators understand disagreements among the levels and dimensions of sex and gender? For example, does classification by subjects, or of subjects by sex at the level of person also work to classify brains or parts of brains by sex, and so on? What about other aspects of biology? As Sarah Richardson has recently asked, does it make sense to use the concept of sex to describe X and Y chromosomes? For example, there are many wonderful iterations of these questions. But on the other hand, these questions are not exactly completely new, and it might be seen as a lack of progress, that they're still being raised. I want to suggest instead that these are perennially wise questions, like the innocent, irritating questions of children who refuse to accept simple appeals to authority because I said so, or teleology because it is. As an answer, the repetition of these fundamental questions forces us to articulate the very most difficult core constructs that we work with in gender and sexuality studies as well as in the sciences. So now 3G sex is a term that was recently introduced by the neuroscientist Daphne Joel as a way to explain that the familiar model of binary sex is not a good model for understanding brain variations. Her full passage, I won't read the whole thing to you, but the core components of it are the combined genital, gonadal, and genetic sex, which she refers to as 3G sex, is internally consistent in roughly 99% of humans. She is quite careful to point out that it's not internally consistent everywhere, and that no one of these three is actually a binary variable. But nonetheless, that there is a very high degree of internal consistency in this composite variable of sex. It's a much higher degree of internal consistency than you see in most multidimensional variables, and so scientists feel justified in using this as a singular variable. At the same time, though, the fact that these two types of, the intersex refers to the phenomenon where somebody either has an intermediate form at one or more levels, or is male in one of these dimensions and female in the others, or is otherwise mixed. But using this model to understand sex differences in other domains, in particular the brain and behavior, leads to the erroneous assumption that sex differences in these other domains are also highly dimorphic and highly consistent. In addition to the fact that neither brain structures nor any behaviors or functional features are as dimorphic as any one of these 3G dimensions, there's dramatic independence across the different constituent elements of both brain morphology, the structures within our brains, and among aspects of cognition, emotion, etc., that are understood typically as female, feminine, or male, masculine. I'm going to show you 3 different models that have been used over the years for understanding sex and gender. We'll start with this bipolar model. So this is an old familiar model. This is a very folk model, if you will, where it's all along one dimension of sex, that things run between poles of masculine and feminine. Being more feminine necessarily within this model entails being less masculine, and vice versa. But everything can roughly be placed on there. Now, this was discarded even in very mainstream psychology and neuroscience quite a long time ago, in the 70s. It's interesting that Sandra Bem proposed a 2-dimensional model in psychology. Neuroscientists a few years later came up with a 2-dimensional model. You'll never see them crediting Sandra Bem for that, by the way, but that's just a little aside. So in this orthogonal model, or 2-dimensional model, you have separate dimensions of masculine traits and feminine traits. And it's quite possible to be either masculine but not feminine, or to be masculine and feminine. It's also quite possible to be not particularly masculine and not particularly feminine. So you can follow those different positions and possibilities throughout that. Nonetheless, it suggests that the elements of those dimensions of cognition or the brain themselves nonetheless are best understood as being either fundamentally masculine or feminine. They're things that should load onto those dimensions from, again, it's sort of a factor analysis perspective. Now there's a third model, and this is the mosaic model. I wish that I could figure out how to get that graphic to stay tangled longer, so let me go back for a second. I just want you to look at that tangle. So the idea of this tangle here is that we have all of these cross-cutting dimensions, and that the thickness and the width, and it's supposed different lines or arrows are longer and some are shorter. I'm trying to give some kind of way of suggesting to you that some of these dimensions are more tightly associated with sex or gender. Other ones have broad distribution. Some of them are only lightly correlated and so on. But they're all going in lots of different directions. They're not on the same planes with each other. If you were to take these elements apart, you can think about this tangle as being either a tangle that represents brain structures that people typically think of as male or female, or cognitive and emotional traits that people think of as masculine or feminine. When you actually think about them individually, you can see that in this model, where you get the idea that any of these is male or female or masculine or feminine is precisely that you can look at a group of people and that you'll find average differences if you do a male-female comparison on any of them. And in each one, you can array them so that there's a masculine side and a feminine side and a general cut point, and that their females tend to fall on one side, males tend to fall on the other. That tend to is really important. Every single one of those differences is a continuous difference. There's no categorical difference in any of these features that we would be talking about. So you go on and you see what happens if you think about individuals. So if those little yellow points are where some individual person might line up on each of those different features of brain or behavior in relation to that midpoint, a population midpoint, or in relation to being on the male side or the female side. And what you see is somebody might sort of cluster around the middle and have more features on one side or the other. You might see an individual here, for example, who is on the female side on most everything and a central part. This individual, especially the more you multiply the characteristics you're looking at, this is a very unusual individual, actually. Our folk notions lead us to expect that people are going to look this way, but this is not actually the typical state of affairs. What you see instead often is something much more like this. To break it down briefly, if you know where I score on a spatial relations test, that's actually not going to tell you anything about how I score on a dominance test, or how aggressive I am, or what my verbal abilities are, or how empathic or nurturing and so on. And that's not just me. It's true of in general. So the fact that some person has a feminine trait in one element completely doesn't allow you to predict that the same person will be feminine for any other element. Instead, individual people show a great deal of internal variety in these respects. So what's the best way to describe this state of affairs? Joelle's idea is to suggest that humans are typically neither male nor female, but intersex in terms of both brain and psychological gender. Now, I disagree with Daphne here. The notion that intersex is the typical state of affairs in the brain and behavior is appealing insofar as it challenges the pervasive pathologization of people with intersex traits. That's the appealing part. But the term intersex suggests that any brain structures or psychological functions that differ at the group level between males and females are proper elements of some phenomenon called sex. And however, if all these traits of brain and behavior don't hang together like 3G sex does, and you can't use these traits to predict the 3G sex of the individual or any of the other traits, why keep calling them by the same term? If we were doing a factor analysis, if we were moving at this from the data itself instead of from the idea of sex, we would never arrive at sex as a variable. So Katrina Karkazis, my colleague who I'm working with on the Olympic project, has written, and I love this passage in her book, Fixing Sex, if one postulates bodies, including genitals, gonads, chromosomes, and hormones, what more does the word sex buy us? The body as a material fact is given, but sex is not. This is a reminder that attachment to sex gender as a framework can, or maybe inevitably does, lead to loss of information. This is clear in sex-specific medicine, for example, where average differences in risk factors between males and females are used as justification for using sex-specific treatments. But sometimes the risk factors themselves are readily knowable, and sometimes covariates with sex or gender, which are also readily knowable, are better predictors. A really great example of that is in a large multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, there were significant male-female differences in arterial elasticity, but it turned out that height was actually a better predictor of arterial elasticity than sex, that once you controlled for height, the sex correlation went away. There are a number of other interesting examples of this, and it's worth recognizing that if you then use sex or gender as a proxy for choosing treatments, you're going to have an unnecessary loss of information, and at worst, gross misclassification that will lead to bad treatment. So the analogy to the function of sex as a variable in medicine is useful because neuroscience research on sex gender is so often justified with the argument that this will advance medical knowledge and treatment, especially for mental health problems that show sex disparities. So I believe that using the term intersex to describe human brains represents a missed opportunity to challenge the potentially infinite expansion of sex that is afforded by the pervasive habit of comparing males and females and the availability of ever larger subject groups and ever finer instruments for discerning physical and functional differences. Habitual comparisons will always yield differences. It's just a property of statistics and large groups. Expanding this catalog of differences between males and females may be confused with generating actual understanding about what such differences mean, what they might reveal about function, how they illuminate important questions about human development, variety, health, and illness. But in fact, that catalog doesn't do that. Now, as Anne and many others have demonstrated through close analyses of scientific practices and interpretations, scientists and other people routinely and inappropriately treat phenomena as dimorphic as soon as they are labeled sex or gender. So, in other words, you go from this tangle, right, but to know it as sex or gender, you pull the tangle apart, you array it along an arbitrarily chosen dimension of sex/gender. And it forces, conceptually, there's a lot of wonderful work out there that shows how it forces dimorphic thinking into how you treat those variables. So mosaicism is not a new concept, but it might be that calling it sexual mosaicism or neural sexual mosaicism, as Sandra Whittleson actually initially framed it, is one reason that mosaicism is acknowledged, but it's very rarely emphasized in mainstream brain research. As long as aspects of the mosaic seem to be sex, there's conceptual pressure towards this dimorphic model, even in the face of all the evidence of actual male-female overlap, as well as the kind of dimensional independence that I described. So as an example, there's a recent article which is a reframing of sexual differentiation of the brain, put forward by Margaret McCarthy and Arthur Arnold in 2011. And in this piece, McCarthy and Arnold strike a good many blows to the classic 20th century model, this what they call the serial model, in which genetic sex determines gonadal sex and gonadal hormones determine brain sex. That's a quote from them. And they make way for a model that involves multiplication of the mechanisms and factors involved, including a greater role for both direct genetic effects outside of the X or Y chromosome, and also the role of sex-specific environments. Now, I can't resist noting that they very matter-of-factly state in this piece that, of course, the old hormonal brain organization model doesn't capture it, and that's not really true. Now, unless you know my work, you don't know why this cracks me up, because this is what my book Brainstorm was about, and many of the same neuroscientists whose work I examined, and later Margaret McCarthy, very firmly defended that model and said that I had sort of somehow been a little bit too choosy about the studies that I looked at or something. So it's an exciting little tidbit that they bury as if it's old news. And maybe we should cite them early and often on the obituary for brain organization theory, and we'll see if the deadness of the theory might stick this time. So anyway. McCarthy and Arnold's complexity and nuance in this piece, which is considerable, it's actually a really great piece, regarding the mechanisms of differentiation is really impressive. At the same time, their approach to the outcome of development is oddly flat. Tucked away in the legend of one of their figures, which is figure 4, the illustration of their model, is an acknowledgement that, quote, variability in the degree to which brain regions are masculinized or feminized in one individual results in a mosaic of relative maleness or femaleness. They identify this as an important aspect of their redefined model, but it's absent from their heuristic illustration and indeed from their text, which is sprinkled with misleading terms such as the male and female phenotype, male and female brain, feminine adult, or masculine adult. Throughout the text, they're talking about unitary phenotypes, and it in no way reflects what's actually supposed to be an important aspect of the model. So here is the heart of the problem. When it comes to brains and behavior, female, feminine, and male, masculine phenotypes do not exist, except as hypothetical composites. Unlike female or male genitals, which roughly describe types that can be observed or used to categorize individuals, albeit imperfectly, brain or behavioral phenotypes are not individual level phenomena. Brain or behavioral phenotypes of sex gender are not individual level phenomena. Because of the high degree of overlap between sexes and within sex variability, specific brain areas or aspects of psychology that are labeled as with sex can be known as such only at the group level. And because of the independence of these elements, mosaicism within individuals, they do not cohere into actual composites, even at the group level. Sex, then, is a non-empirical phenomenon when it comes to brain and behavior. What appears to be sex is the pure effect of research methods, habitual comparisons of males and females, and of a commitment to abstract composites or ideal types that are frankly counterfactual. Now, keep in mind, I'm not disputing 3G sex. I'm saying that this is actually not, it's a counterfactual model when you're thinking about anything about psychology and brains. So how does it come about that we are so convinced that these things work? So I'm going to show you 7 easy steps to the sexual brain. First, and this is how you get there, it's easy peasy. This is a self-help manual. It guarantees that you will get funding in some of the new programs in sex difference neuroscience, because there's a gigantic new funding stream to do this. Okay, so you begin by splitting every sample into female and male. Use their identities or use 3G sex. Second, you compare females and males on everything you can think of, and then you report only the differences. You then transform the differences from quantitative overlapping distributions to qualitative by calling them female type or male type. The next thing you do is use the same term, sex, for the construct used to group the subjects, which was roughly dimorphic in the subject group, and the construct that emerges from comparison, which is dimorphic only after the transformation. Number 5, you ignore rampant misclassification. What that means is pay no attention to the fact that a large minority of subjects who are male at the level of person will be female at the level of any particular brain area or behavioral trait, and vice versa. Next, you repeat these steps in different subject groups and with different methods, but always creating dimorphic constructs through active transformation of continuous phenomena. And finally, you also continue using the same term, sex, for the a priori and emergent constructs, and the same category for terms female and male for each. Ignore the fact that across individual persons, identified their identity and their 3G sex, times the structure A, or figure the person by structure A, by structure B, by structure C, and so on. So you're looking at sort of like a matrix, a correlation matrix of people in these areas. The construct of sex has dramatically low internal consistency. It drops. It's already low if you look even at 2 structures or 2 traits. Beyond that, it's vanishingly small. Okay. So what are you going to do from there? Well, the old-fashioned thing to do would be to start down here with what runs along the bottom. That's sort of the classic model. You have groups that are simplified as the most important thing in there is, some kind of idea of initial underlying sex biology. You do an experiment. You capture this sort of any kind of difference in your experiment has a straight line right back to that initial aspect of biology, and you don't really have to think about too much else beyond that. But then the other thing that you could do is, it turns out that we're in a really exciting era of where feminist insights are actually being tested, revised, and expanded by careful and specific empirical research, exploring the relations of particular developmental conditions and mechanisms to particular forms of brain structures, physiological functions, or behavior. One of the best examples of this is the study of the emergence of sex differences in early life, undertaken by Anne and her colleagues in their Sexing the Baby project. But there are others doing this work as well. Feminist neuroscientists Anneliese Kaiser in Switzerland, Debolina Roy in the US, Gillian Einstein in Canada, Raffaella Rumiati in Italy, just to name 4 of my favorites, are translating years of feminist thought experiments into empirical explorations of sex gender, not as a trait of people or brains, but as a situation or a context that is sometimes quite salient, but nearly always contingent. Thinking about sex gender as one of the functions facilitated by particular aspects of biology or behavior, instead of as the true purpose or driving force behind these, is probably the most important conceptual shift in this work. So you see, this scheme that I'm showing you here is actually coming from a piece that is coming out, I hope. Actually, that's a little premature. It's a piece that I've been working on with Cordelia Fine, Gina Rippon, and Anneliese Kaiser. And if you notice, what we tried to do here is show the different ways, first, that the social world, in fact, gets entangled into this phenomenon that ends up in the experiment. So you can't just look at the males and females that show up in an experiment and think that the differences that you observe are due to biology. You have to know that the social world has always been active in shaping those differences that emerge. Next, you have to think very concretely about the aspects of the experiment itself. And then you want to notice that your experiment, oops, what happened? Wow, my slide went away. Did you guys get it? Oh, wow. I switched so that you're looking at what? I don't have swap on my screen, so can you?
Oh. Yeah, let's do that.
Sorry.
See if that works.
Yeah, okay. So I'll move forward. There we go. Okay, so it's always entangled, and then here you want to really particularly note that your methods are also entangled, just as an example, with stereotype threat, and with the feedback of results into popularization, which then turns into a new loop with gender socialization via stereotype threat that happens both before and during your experiment. So the final piece that I want to just point out that happens is, in the end, your results are not the stable state of affairs that you expect to see everywhere, but they're a snapshot, and you recognize that those results are going to always be contingent. So what's the fate of sex? I can't tell you how thrilled I was to see this quote in a very mainstream neuroscience article just coming out about a month ago, and quoting JBS Haldane. Now, my own suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. And I will only say that the work on entanglement is something that is finally going forward. I am over my time, so I can't talk more than 1 second about the fact that that one of the most important things that's happening in this, for some reason my slide, it won't show that part of the animation, is to show that sex and gender are completely also co-constructed with other social domains, and that they are not just dimensions of difference, but they're dimensions of power. They're differential, they're power hierarchies, and those are things that are also being recognized with the entanglement. I'm sorry it didn't show on my slide, but I thank you very much again.
Thank you. Any questions? Oh, wait for the microphone, if you can, which is...
I'll just speak very loud.
Okay, speak loud.
I just have a quick question about whether you think that a more open discussion about trans people is affecting this kind of research.
It's a really good question. I don't know. I'll tell you that I do a whole lot of work in the Netherlands, and the phenomenon of trans is so different in the United States from the Netherlands that that actually raises a whole lot of interesting avenues for thinking and moving forward. I don't feel like I have a good, ready answer to that, except to say that much of the mainstream work on for example, brain organization theory, the work that's done in humans. Trans people have been used, and I mean that in every sense of the word, as research subjects from very, very early on. And there are, in particular, some of the looping effects that you can see in the kind of design that I laid out are pretty clear, I think, and commented upon when you see, for example, the relationship between trans people and research communities in cognitive neuroscience in the Netherlands versus in the US. This is an issue that hasn't, to my knowledge, been really discussed in very deep or extended ways in trans scholarship yet, but I think it'd be really interesting to do. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. Are there any male researchers doing this work on sex and gender that are notable?
Who are doing the kind of contextual contingent research like that?
Yes.
You know, it's interesting. I know a couple of male researchers who are, in fact, who approach sex in this way in their work. What's interesting is they're not sex researchers per se, but when they do engage sex as a variable in their work, they don't just treat it as a stable, knowable, permanent trait that individuals have. One is my own mentor, Evan Balaban, who I think does this quite beautifully. Evan Balaban is a really amazing cognitive and developmental neuroscientist. He almost never takes sex as the subject of his work, but he looks at, for example, he looks at sex differences in birdsong. It's a major part of his work, and he's very interesting in doing that. Yeah.
Thank you. This was wonderful, as always. Can I get you to back up to the 3G sex business?
Sure.
I wasn't following you quick enough.
Sure.
You're saying that, if you go back to the slide, are you saying
Sure.
that the genetic, gonadal, genital thing lines up 90-something% of the time?
99% of the time.
Okay. Can you say a little bit more? So I take this that you're taking this as some kind of anchor against which you want the behavioural complexity to emerge.
Yeah.
Can you say something, because obviously genetics, gonads and genitals are all internally inconsistent.
Yeah.
I mean, genetics, folds. Can you say a little bit more about how that 3G is internally inconsistent?
Well, actually,
Or is it not? I mean,
It's,
you say
it's
more
not
about
in,
what you're thinking.
in quite the same way. So here's the thing it's a little, I'll admit, I'm actually really glad for your question. It's a complicated question, and I'm glad for it in part because I'm ambivalent about using 3G sex as this foil. But at the same time, I think I keep coming back to it. I feel like it's a useful foil, at least as a step. I think it's important to recognize that it isn't that none of these elements are in fact dimorphic, that none of these elements lines up perfectly. And at the same time, because of, I think here's the issue. Scientists, especially anybody working with humans on any kind of research, they don't expect perfect variables and constructs and perfect correlations, within good constructs ever. And if you look at the behavior of this as a composite, it has quite high internal consistency and quite good factor analytic predictivity across people in the way that you would expect for other kinds of useful variables that you could predict things with. And that's one of the reasons that I go ahead and hold on to this for now. But that wonderful quote at the end that I gave you about the wonderfully queerer world is actually part of a very recently emerging body of work on genetic mosaicism. And here we're not talking about X and Y, we're talking about whole genome mosaicism. And what's really exciting in the piece that I quote from is that, well, first of all, mosaicism has been understood to exist for quite a long time, but in recent years it has been just discovered far more frequently than had been the case, and it turns out that it's actually the rule, it's not the exception, that mosaicism is found dramatically. And what's even more exciting is that the brain is apparently the home of the most intense mosaicism that has been found yet in the body. And so there are ways in which, if you think beyond X, Y, and you think about the way that X and Y are not independent elements somewhere, but the kinds of contingencies and interactions that are required for any sort of gene expression, I think the more we learn about broad mosaicism, the more we might even have to revise what a model like this can tell us as that foil.
That's very helpful, thank you, because it seems to me that I see exactly what you're saying rhetorically.
Yeah.
And the strategy that you're in.
Right.
I get all that on board. But it seems that that very strategy that you're deploying is actually also internal to each
Yeah.
other, that it has a thing that's kind of set for them
Yeah.
attached to something that's diversifying.
Right. And I think that what it really comes down to is thinking about, I would like to see the concept of sex actually narrowed as much as possible to, when I think about sex not as a location in the body or as bits, but if we think about sex as a particular function that some tissues fulfill among other functions that they fulfill, some cells and tissues participate in functions of sex, I think sex could get restricted to actually thinking about reproduction. And I think that we could free up all of the other kinds of things that we've glommed onto that in ways that might be ultimately a lot more useful. Thank you.
So our final speaker today is Sarah Richardson, who's Assistant Professor of the History of Science and Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Harvard. Her 2013 book, Sex Itself, The Search for Male and Female in the Human Genome, traces the history of genetic theories of sex differences from 1900 to the present. In 2008, she co-edited Revisiting Race in a Genomic Age, and her new book project has the working title, The Maternal Mystique, and theorizes and situates maternal effects research within the 20th century life sciences. And today she'll be speaking to us on gender in the human genome.
Thank you. Like the other speakers, I'm absolutely honored to be here. A little shorter than everyone, so I'm just going to move this down. Anne, you're an intellectual hero to me and an inspiration, and your work has been absolutely foundational to everything I've done and will continue to be. And Beck's talk really set up the theme of my talk nicely, which is a continued focus on the overstating of differences, the recurrence and the return to differences in research, even in the face of contradicting findings. Now, in my book, Sex Itself, I track the emergence of the new and distinctive way of thinking about sex that came into being with the unalterable, simple, and visually compelling binary of the X and Y chromosomes, which is a relatively recent new understanding of sex, in fact. I track this from the beginning of the 20th century all the way up to the present post-genomic age, and I analyze the history of the X and Y chromosomes as gendered objects of scientific knowledge, and I also show how prevailing gender conceptions inform the direction of sex chromosome research and genomic research today. Now, it's a little late in the symposium, and I thought we might want a video to shake things up a little bit. Let me make sure the audio cord is in here. Excuse me. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to show you is about a 2.5-minute clip from a recent TED-type talk by the geneticist David Page. Of course, Anne was the first to write about David Page's work in her article, Gender in the XY Corral. She always had a great knack for great titles and use of language, path-breaking article on the search for the male sex-determining gene. So this though, is just from this fall. So it's a few months ago, and David Page is a leading Y chromosome researcher at the Whitehead Institute at MIT and Harvard. And I'll just let it speak for itself.
It has been said many times that our genomes are all 99.9% identical from one person to the next. This idea that we're 99.9% identical has gained great traction, and for a number of reasons. It's very appealing to say that we're all 99.9% identical. It's so appealing that this idea was seized upon by President Bill Clinton in his 2000 State of the Union address, when he stated that this fall at the White House, we had a distinguished scientist visiting, an expert in this work on the human genome, and he said that we are all, regardless of race, genetically 99.9% the same. Well, it turns out that this idea is even correct, as long as the two individuals being compared are both men. It's also correct if the two individuals being compared are both women. However, if you compare the genome of a man with the genome of a woman, you'll find that they are actually only 98.5%. In other words, the genetic difference between a man and a woman is 15 times the genetic difference between two men or between two women. Let us consider, for example, the case of Bill and Hillary. So it turns out that Bill is as genetically similar to Hillary as he is to a male chimpanzee.
Wow.
But human genome, we have a problem. In the human genome era in which we're living, this difference, this fundamental difference between males and females has been overlooked. Instead, we have been operating with a unisex vision of the human genome. And so, in fact, men and women are not equal in their genome, as I've just explained. And as I want to go on with...
Okay, I'll stop there. So this is Part of this symposium is to look forward, and I think one of the ways that we need to go is to look, as we enter into an age in which all conceptions of human difference will be recast in the language of precision and quantitative analysis of our time, which is the genome. We need to be moving gender analysis to this new terrain and familiarizing ourselves with its language. I want to step back, and when I look at this image, I see Anne, and locate myself in feminist scholarship, by which I mean a kind of situated, embodied, accountable project of knowledge production, where we are interested in producing knowledge that matters, in thinking from the margins, and in provoking transformative conversations. It's an ethical practice as well as a knowledge practice, and I certainly think about Anne as representing all of that as a model. So this field, feminist science studies, which Anne, as much as anyone else, has helped to pave and create, this interdisciplinary, intersectional field where we are thinking very deeply about science and its methods and its empirics, while also showing a sensitivity, a kind of critical sensitivity to the category of gender in science. In this field, Anne has been known more than anything for providing us with very close, careful case studies of the operation of gender in particular fields of the sciences. Careful, context-specific studies showing the many ways in which gender works in and through the science. And in this terrain, she has opened up a broad range of intellectual inquiries about the interaction between cultural conceptions of human difference, including gender difference, and our intellectual matrices of conceptual binaries, supporting binaries, and conceptual fields that are the fundamental matrices on which our understanding of sex and gender difference rely. And Anne has also always been very attentive to the way in which, when we speak about nature, we are at the same time constructing our present and future reality. We are talking about the social order as well. We are using social categories, and we are talking normatively and evaluatively about the world. And all of these things I appreciate very much about your work, Anne. One frame for my own inquiry into gender in the human genome is to think about the history of what we've come to call sexual science, the history of ideas about sex differences in the body. And now different eras, as this work has so carefully shown, have produced different models of sex differences. And these models of sex differences tend to correspond to the favored technologies and conceptions of the body of the at the time. Now, none of these eras are discrete per se, but they do represent important shifting knowledge regimes, from looking at the blood and the pelvis, to the skull and the brain, to hormones, and now today, I would argue, the genome. Now, this practice of Anne's, which we might call analyzing gender and science, has shown us that the redescription of sex differences in these new modalities, say in hormone science or in brain science today, does not eviscerate the fundamental problems of reasoning encountered in the past. So some of the common, well-documented errors and biases of this work that we can get from Anne's foundational works, Myths of Gender and Sexing the Body, around assuming a binary, then overstating the difference, and re-deriving a view of nature that reaffirms our stereotypes in this looping way that Beck described. We see how this is reinvigorated, sometimes with even less criticality about those assumptions when we enter into a new terrain. So I want to take up David Page's question. In my book, I have a whole chapter with this title, so I will only be able to briefly explore it. But I showed you that clip to demonstrate that leading people in the field of sex research in the genome are putting forward a very strong picture of sex differences. And the notion here is that now that we have the sequence of the human genome, we are going to at last, with great precision and at a deeper level than ever, understand the real differences between males and females. This at last will find those differences. So here's Mark Ross at the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, who led the X chromosome sequencing effort there, who says, now that we've got the sequence of both sex chromosomes, we can do a very detailed comparison to really ask the differences between male and female. And here's Hunt Willard, an X chromosome researcher at Duke University, who says that human males and females differ by, quote, 2%, greater than the hereditary gap between humankind and its closest relative, the chimpanzee. And he further argues that there is not one human genome, but actually two, male and female. Now, some of this came out of some early studies after the initial release of the sequence of the X chromosome in 2005, in which Willard, along with Laura Carroll at Penn, did a little study showing that some of the genes on the X chromosome in females escape from inactivation. Don't worry about the science here. I'm just looking at how they count up genes in males and females. And they argued that there are 200 to 300 genes that are expressed twice as much in females than in males. This is a huge number, said Hunt Willard. Well, in my book, I go through and I show how this finding systematically skewed the results and was never replicated. Subsequent studies, if anything, have found maybe 36 genes. Another one says maybe 9 genes, and they certainly don't express twice as much in females. And I really do argue that this discrepancy can be accounted for following Anne's model of close analysis of inferential reasoning and the assumptions that go at each stage of systematic skewing of the results to favor findings of sex differences. So researchers failed to, for example, subtract out the genes that escape from inactivation on the X chromosome that are also present on the Y chromosome. They assumed that genes that escape from inactivation on the female X chromosome actually represent a double dosage of that gene. That turns out to be far from the truth. So that's just a couple of examples of how researchers looked for sex differences and they found it. They never considered alternative models or theories for why they were seeing what they were seeing. They assumed that those differences that they saw in the genome would be reflected and must explain phenotypic differences in a global way between males and females. So all of this is to say we're entering a brave new world of searching for sex differences in the genome. And it's a kind of quantitative effort. You can count up genes that differ in levels of expression or are unique to males and females. And there's a huge industry right now to search for genes involved in sex-specific expression or pathways in various tissues of the body, including the brain, the heart, the liver, and in complex diseases like cardiovascular disease or diabetes. So theories of the genetic etiology of diseases, ranging from autism to schizophrenia and major depression to cardiovascular disease and diabetes, now invoke what we call sex-biased gene expression or sex-dependent genetic effects or pathways. Unfortunately, these studies are full of problems, and I'll just briefly discuss this 2007 study by the Ioannidis group in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The authors are well-known biostatisticians, and they analyzed 432 claims of genetic sex differences in 77 recent peer-reviewed research articles, and their findings are remarkable. After statistical reanalysis using the raw study data, they found that 55.9% of the published claims were not statistically significant. And in addition, in all but 12.7% of the articles, the studies contained serious flaws in design, and they concluded that 74 of the claims were actually wholly spurious. Only 37% of the claims were stated to rely on a priori considerations, had raw study data available that documented that they were nominally statistically significant, and had analysis performed on the whole study sample, criteria that are fairly uncontroversial that they set up as suggesting it was a sound and robust study. In the end, the study found only 2 claims that met all of their criteria for an internally sound finding of sex differences, and furthermore had also been replicated by at least 1 other study. This problem of lack of replication in genomic studies is really, really important. This is true all over genome research, but in sex difference research, where there's a kind of lack of criticality about these findings, it's especially important to make sure that it's been found in multiple samples multiple times, and that's a major problem in this field. Some of the conclusions of the study, and there are endemic problems in sex difference research studies, including lack of replication, but also poor study group design, including lack of controls and inadequately powered, meaning small size subgroup analysis. And the study, the authors concluded that gene sex differences are actually likely to be rare, small, and difficult to corroborate, and that in genetic studies related to sex, the vast majority of claimed subgroup differences are likely to be chance findings. So to continue my allegory about the overemphasis on sex differences, I will conclude by discussing some studies that were in the news just last week. So last week's news about 2 Y chromosome studies offers an allegory for our age about the way scientific hype and a fascination with the sex binary continues to influence genetic research on sex today. So last week Nature published 2 back-to-back articles on the Y chromosome, and it garnered extensive media attention. What did the study show? The study investigated the evolutionary history of 12 genes on the Y chromosome. So males have 1 X chromosome and females have 2. And the studies found that these 12 unexplained genes are present also on the X chromosome. So the reason that they found for their presence on the Y chromosome is that males and females actually need a similar dosage of that gene product. So the studies actually demonstrated that these genes play a role all over the genome, a regulatory role, and they don't actually know precisely what the genes do, but they do know that fetal viability is impaired without proper functioning of both doses of them. So in short, this is a very unsexy study that shows similarity between males and females, a mechanism in the genome to equalize dosage between males and females. But of course, what did the news report and how did the scientists themselves describe the significance of their research in the coverage? And this includes both science coverage, like in Science and Nature when they interpreted lay terms, the work for the public, but also in sources like the New York Times, all the way to the Huffington Post. And I would really compare this to Anne's famous case of the corpus callosum. When Anne looked at the corpus callosum, this is a touchstone example, studies in the 1980s to find quantitative sex differences in measurements of the corpus callosum that recursively moved from one dimension to another when they couldn't find a difference. And the way that she shows the constant search for difference. If you don't find it, it has to be somewhere, so you need another kind of measurement, another tool, another dimension. So how did the New York Times report this? They reported that scientists had discovered 12 genes on the Y chromosome that, quote, play high-level roles in controlling the state of the genome and the activation of other genes. In no way do the studies provide any evidence of this. These genes, furthermore, quote, may represent a fundamental difference in how the cells in men's and women's bodies read off the information in their genomes. And one of the study's authors, the study's authors actually reaffirm this message in all of the articles in which they're quoted. They state that these special genes, quote, may play a large role in differences between males and females. So, you know, how does a study of gene dosage equalization between males and females become framed framed as a major new finding of sex differences. I think, Beck, you might add this as step 8. If you find no differences at all, just spin it as differences anyway, right? So last week's Y chromosome studies show the continuing stubborn influence of this sex difference paradigm that Anne has been such a steady critic of. The study presents an unsexy claim that certain genes on the Y chromosome work to ensure sexual similarity, but filtered through our gender scripts and through scientific hype, it becomes a revolutionary new finding said to have groundbreaking implications for our understanding of the genetic basis of sex differences. So, a question for us going forward is, how can we break this sex difference paradigm? And I think that there isn't a single univocal answer. The model provided by Anne is one of continuing critical address, engagement with the science that is both critical and constructive, posing alternatives while constantly remaining critically aware and engaged. So what I hope to have at least pointed out to you is that there's now a robust conception of genomic sex differences emerging from genomic research. There's very little criticality out there about its starting premises or aware of existing criticisms that come from gender studies. And actually very little engagement so far from science studies and feminist science studies even those with an interest in gender. So here is one new agenda for feminist science studies going forward. Thank you.
Can we invite some questions?
So maybe one way of talking about this lack of criticality is how, in general, how the public take all these studies, like the one that you just mentioned. Is that we usually take all these scientific studies as they are explaining the differences that we observe in our daily life between people categorized as male or female, but they are just mere descriptions of what they are seeing. So maybe we see differences between, how people dress, and then a scientist sees some differences in, in the brain, or, letting aside whether or not those differences actually are there, if they are a result of, bias or not. So maybe the idea is that they are not explaining, and maybe we think that they are explaining the difference that we see, but they are merely describing more difference. So they are just adding to the catalog. I don't know, what do you think about this, maybe this describing versus explaining?
Right. Well, I'll say two things. I mean, it's certainly true that the data don't speak for themselves. So a finding of differences may actually have very little biological meaning at all, or a difference might be a convergence, as Margaret McCarthy has pointed out. A difference may be something that, as the Y chromosome study shows, actually spells a convergence. So a simplistic assumption that a finding of quantitative differences equals an actual difference is one thing. The other thing is this looping effect. I thought the first part of your question was about this effect of popularization and expectations and the way in which that uptake context, that context of receptivity, then contributes to the narratives that both scientists and science translators, like journalists, produce about findings. It's just impossible for them to get out of them, and there is a looping effect. The kinds of research that scientists find interesting to do, the ways in which they script and narrate the findings of their research is in dialogue with those expectations. And I appreciated back on your chart there, the conclusion of that loop of popularization. I had never seen that before, and I think that's very effective.
What does all this say about peer review? Peer review that's supposed to make our science. The statistical information is just appalling. 480 some articles that were all peer reviewed that don't pass simple muster.
Well, as you may be aware, there's a big discussion going on right now around the influence of glamour publications like Science and Nature, systems of scientific hype and publicity, and incredibly resource poor competitive research environment, where all of which combine to reduce the time available for proper peer review and increase the pressures for publication. I think that I'm also working on another topic, which is post-genomics, and I think that it is a challenging moment for genomics in particular in reviewing and evaluating these claims. In the field of sex difference research, I think a lot of these researchers actually have no background in sex differences, so all genomic samples are just tagged with sex. So they may be, in other words, they're entering into an epistemically challenging field, but they don't know it. They think they've found a difference in their data, and interesting result, let's report it, someone else will figure out what it means. So I think there are many things going on here, but I think if you speak to any scientists, they themselves are quite worried about the state of peer review in these fields. On the other hand, you might say these fields have a very permissive view of what is interesting, and differences are certainly more interesting than similarities, and they are willing to put the studies out there because they feel there's an importance to sex difference research. And part of that importance to sex difference research, by the way, comes from some actors within the women's health movement who are pushing very hard for more and more sex difference research because of the history of lack of inclusion of women in research. So there are many ironies to the situation.
True with race as well. I mean, some of this replicates the old one-drop logic of racial difference in medical work. You know, that everything can be attributed to that one drop or that one gene.
Maybe one more question.
Are you at all optimistic that the study of epigenetics might help us move beyond the sex differences paradigm?
Great question. I'm also working on epigenetics, and I actually find that research laced with the very same assumptions, unfortunately. The hope, of course, was that epigenetics would provide us that mechanism for understanding the nature-nurture interaction. And at this time, what epigenetics looks like is just like genetics. It's very focused around a regulatory story at the level of the DNA. So I think it's not that epigenetics is the same. There are some interesting differences with epigenetics research, but in looking, for example, at maternal effects research in epigenetics, I find many of the same assumptions and, of course, an interest in differences all along. But perhaps it's early days yet. Yeah, perhaps there's room.
Okay, thank you very much. So a couple of things. First, let me just thank our panelists. Thank you, all four of you. We decided we'd let Anne have a word now, but before she does, let me just say we're about to, after she speaks, we're going to take a break for kind of coffee break. Please take a look at this exhibition along the back wall. There's a guest book over there. If the panelists can step over there for a photograph. And now, Anne, please.
Thanks, Tara. I just want to make this brief, but I wanted to take just a moment to do some thank yous. First, I wanted to thank everyone for coming today. It's such a wonderful mixture of longtime friends, longtime colleagues, former students, current students, and new colleagues. So it's really a great combination of people here, and it's really wonderful to see you all here, and I appreciate your coming. I also wanted to take a chance to thank the panel, of course, and I have lots of little comments to give them individually, just thoughts later. But I especially wanted to thank the people who were most instrumental in organizing this, organizing it on top of their busy schedule with a great deal of equanimity, especially Tara, also Debbie, Tara. I, of course, thank the
the entities that sponsored, and that means for the non-academics in the room, gave money, which is important. I also wanted to thank the people who often get lost in these. These are the people who really did all of the hard work, the organizing work, either for the exhibitions or for arranging people's travel or for getting websites up and running, and specifically Martha Hamblett, Cherry Guerzon, if I mispronounced your name, I'm sorry, Wendy Corwin, Claudia Norton, and then a whole bunch of other people involved with both the Pembroke Center, the History Department, and a couple of other student workers. But I just wanted to offer them personally my thanks as well, and to know that, for you all to know that no event like this can get organized without the people behind the scenes doing all of this really hard work. So thank you all.